Joe Lindsley is a traveler and writer, an American previously reporting on Chicago's WGN radio from Ukraine each and every day. We're going to talk about that a little bit in this episode as well, what Joe is doing to fulfill his time and have an impact following the cancellation of that show. But Joe's been in Ukraine for the entire full-scale war, creating a unique body of work that tries to look at the reality of Ukraine and its resistance against revanchist Russian imperialism. Welcome to Silicon Curtain. Please make sure you are subscribed so you don't miss out on any of the incredible speakers that we have on the channel. And also thank you to everybody who supports the work of Joe, who supports my work as well through Patreon and Buy Me a Coffee. It is absolutely essential. It enables us to keep these sort of shows on the road, as it were. Joe, welcome back.
Hey, Jonathan, great to talk to you. Hello from Kyiv, and it was an honor to see you here in Kyiv just a few weeks ago, and great to see how many people, especially Ukrainians here in Kyiv, we're so happy to see you in person to talk. So that was a energizing visit.
That was fantastic. Well, we had a fantastic lunch. We recorded probably one of our best conversations face to face. It convinced me that we should be doing a lot more of those. But no, it was a real privilege and a thrill to be in Kiev for the first time, Lviv for the second time, and yeah, we did. We had a lot of conversations. Many of them have not yet been published fully on the channel, so there's a lot more for people to look forward to there coming over the next couple of weeks. And there's one with the leading Ukrainian journalist that's going up today and tomorrow, doing the subtitles for it with Vitaly Portnikov. Absolutely kind of thrilling because he has an interesting view of Trump, Kellogg, Putin, and so on. I would sort of call it a non-ideological view, but one very, very rooted in understanding, the Russian media environment, understanding the Western media environment, how it's been weaponized, and of course he understands Ukrainian politics. And this is where I think we come in. These conversations which try to step outside of partisan bubbles. How important is it at this point to not just be sniping the other side, but trying to engage in conversations with people who perhaps ideologically we don't necessarily agree with?
Well, and I'd say, as I understand it, I think everything we're going to be talking about during this session today is ultimately about information. Whether it's talking about, which we will talk about, the USAID situation, talking about General Kellogg, how are people informed? How do people receive information to understand the real situation, to determine, where the strengths are, where the weaknesses are, and then how do we, if you're trying to persuade people, and this was, we had such a great conversation, Jonathan, with your crew of friends in the UK. You guys brought trucks here to Ukraine, and we were in the pub talking. A wonderful conversation about empathy, and it was something I've been thinking about a lot. But if you want to persuade people, if you want people to hear your story, and this is what the philosopher from Kharkiv said in your interview, going back to quoting Aristotle, all this too. If you want to persuade people, you have to understand them. You have to understand where they're coming from, and the Russians do this supremely well. So that's another thing I hope to discuss during this time. But how the Russian propaganda really works and how we can be smart about it so that we are aware of how it's influencing us. And then, of course, to discuss the USAID story of, what is the mood right now in America? And then thirdly, how, and maybe we start with this part, is how to, what is the story that needs to be told about Ukraine that I think is getting missed. And even I'll say, for example, a few days ago, I was meeting with a retired American general, a guy who loves Ukraine, and he raises a lot of money and does great stuff for Ukraine. And in the conversation, the general said to me, he was saying I was a bit of an optimist about things. He's like, Joe, we have to accept, that Crimea is not possible and all this stuff. And it was all the list of negatives, things that are not possible. And he's a general, and generals, speak with authority. And who am I to question it? And so I said, I have my mind for a second. I'm like, I'm not going to argue or anything. And then I said, come on, wait a second. I know I've been here every day for 3 years. I know the reality. I know the dark moments and then the better moments. And so I started to tell the general, I told the general the story. I said, General, I see what you're saying, but, let's look at these other points. Like when in May of 2024, and so this is what I would like General Kellogg to hear, because I don't think he knows this. And my conversation with this American general in Kyiv, the retired general, showed me that like the things that we think are obvious, they just simply don't know, including in the White House. And so our mission must be to share these stories very energetically. And so, we can go through a bunch of them, but the quick one I'll say now is Kharkiv in May of 2024 was being destroyed. And the Russians were they thought they were making one final effort to get people to flee the city and destroy it. And it was terrible. It was so terrible that there was almost a universal chorus throughout the world. And this is a good lesson. Anyone who supported Ukraine was very precise. They said to Joe Biden, they said, give Ukraine permission to fire back on Russian soil in a limited way to protect Kharkiv. Let's just do that. Let's achieve that. And if you look at all the headlines and stories in that month, it was Kharkiv's going to fall. Kharkiv's going to fall. And from my conversations with people in Washington, for almost a year, they'd been hoping almost that Kharkiv would fall as a bargaining chip, and some way to break the impasse. Well, within about 24 hours of the White House giving permission for Ukrainians to use HIMARS to hit Russian launch points on Russian soil in a very limited way, which, by the way, was one of Putin's red lines in June of 20. Sorry, no, yeah, but he's always been saying this, that if you use HIMARS on Russian soil, he'd go nuclear. Within about 24 hours of Ukrainians getting that permission, the attacks on Kharkiv stopped. But there was no reporting on that. And this is what I would say to General Kellogg and others, because they don't even know this. They know that there was a permission given at the end of May, but what they don't know is what happened immediately afterward, which is extraordinary. And because the absence of a problem is a harder story to tell, right? It's easy to say I'm getting bombed right now. It's hard to say I'm not getting bombed and I haven't been in a while. So what we had when that permission was given, it was one of the most peaceful months in Kharkiv since the beginning of the full-scale war, and not a story about it. And what that showed is, far from Putin's threats, for crossing red lines, when we get tough and we give the tools Ukrainians need, Russia gets weaker. And so for 30 days, Kharkiv, there might have been one attack. It was extremely peaceful. But what happened? Well, we did nothing. We didn't seize the opportunity to say, oh, let's double down. Let's go beyond the 150 kilometers into Russia. Let's just wait. And so what happened? Russia regroups. They get strength. They move back into the newly created safe space for attacking Ukraine. And by July, the attacks continued. Less intense because they're further away. But no one watched that story. No one paid attention to it. By the same token, with the incursion into Kursk, Russia was weakened at that point. It put them on edge, and at that point, Russians were. It was August, and all the experts, many great experts, were saying that the Ukrainian city of Pokrovsk was going to fall within a matter of weeks. That was August, Jonathan, of last year.
It's still there. It's still standing.
Still there. I mean, the civilians are mainly gone, and the city's destroyed, but it's still there. And you could read stories in August and September, and they're like, oh, Pokrovsk is going to fall in a week. And then Dnipro, the major city of Dnipro, the Russians are going to be there. It's February 10th as we talk today. Pokrovsk is still there. I have friends there. No one talks about it, though. No one says, oh, wait a second. Wait, we said it was going to fall, but now it's not. You never see that story. And so as a result, people, including General Kellogg, don't see that story. And they don't have these positive, like, okay, wait a second. This gives me energy to say that we are tougher than we realize and stronger than we realize. And then the other thing to connect that to is Kursk. A lot of analysts say, well, maybe it was stupid to go into Kursk. Well, it certainly changed some things because Pokrovsk and other places were about to fall. Russia became weak. They became so weak, they had to go to use, I think, a favorite term of Trump, what is he called? The shithole nations. Well, I'd say North Korea is that. Russia had to turn to that country, North Korea, from a point of weakness in order to get stronger. And so, yes, in time, they got stronger, but only because they were put in such a bad spot. And so this is what, in the narratives, this is what gets missed, these points of strength. And maybe the last thing on that score, which no one has talked about, I'm talking to you from Kyiv. I have electricity and internet and heat. Jonathan, you were here a few weeks ago. Did you have any power outages when you were here?
No, not a single
Did you hear
one.
any generators? So
No, they were in the corner of every cafe, but they weren't in use. They were just there as a backup. So I didn't experience that whole, diesel fumes everywhere kind of thing. And I do know that it was predicted. If you go back and see articles, and that includes not just Western articles, but also articles in the Ukrainian media around September, they were saying, look, this is going to be a much tougher winter. And they were predicting all sorts of things were going to happen. But it seems Russia does not have either Russia doesn't have the strength to inflict that kind of suffering, or it's a combination that Ukrainian resilience is able to repair stuff now at such a kind of in such an agile way that Russian strikes can no longer, take the network down.
and even a third point to that, because we had very brutal winters, especially 2 winters ago, and Ukrainians simply adapted. They learned to live in the Middle Ages by candlelight. It didn't matter. At first it was terrible. People got used to it, and they found the bright side of it. And so, if you're looking for, Russia's thinking, how do we spend our money and trying to, kill Ukraine? You realize that that's not going to work. But the thing is, like, if we had no power and the infrastructure was totally destroyed, as everyone predicted, I mean, it still is weakened, but miraculously, Ukrainians keep going. Then there'd be a lot of stories about it, and it'd be all this negative stuff. But there's no stories about the absence of the problem, which is actually a victory. And if the Trump team and General Kellogg was we need them to be keenly aware of these things. These are our strengths. This means Russia is actually quite weak
It's
for all of its
incredibly weak. I
bluster.
mean, we'll come on to
Yes.
the economy in a
Yeah.
minute because it seems to
Mhm.
me there's a huge systemic problem there. The challenge, of course, is that Kellogg, he he does come, he has visited Ukraine. He does talk to people who are on the ground. So he has a better class of information, but he doesn't have all the information. He doesn't have all the information that you and I would want him to have. And also, he's exposed to a lot of this sort of Western media analytical framework, which I think ultimately we've got out of the habit of thinking in a leadership fashion. We've got out of the habit of creating opportunities, seeing opportunity almost where there's a dead end situation and being able to think outside the box. Now, Ukraine seems to be able to do that. And this is, I think, key to Zelensky's recent point. He was saying, look, we might not get Crimea back immediately. We might not get Donbass back immediately, but we're not going to cede that sovereignty to Russia. And actually, Russia is in a weak long-term position. We will take these things back when Russia collapses. So there's extraordinary thinking outside the box and thinking more sort of long-term rather than this sort of momentary catastrophic, lack of imagination. The challenge is how do we get Kellogg to understand that Ukrainians are able to create these opportunities for victory? We saw Biden, unfortunately, didn't move. He moved at the pace of Washington, or he moved at the pace of sort of internal administrative and legal processes, which is sort of, frustratingly slow, of course. And so many of these opportunities were kind of missed. Kursk could have been a far bigger victory and more territory taken and more pain inflicted if allies had been able to move at the speed of Ukraine rather than at the speed of democracy in peacetime with their sclerotic bureaucracy and military-industrial complex. So, what's your plan to get Kellogg to start understanding this Ukrainian skill to create opportunity?
Well, first, Jonathan, I think it is making sure that we tell the story clearly. As I saw with my conversation here with the great American general here, that at first I was gonna, I was almost shy. I'm like, well, he's a general, he's got to know more stuff than I do. And then we always have to realize that's not the case. And I've seen this so often with people in power. Other people are whispering into their ears with less knowledge. We have to be very loud and captivating with our storytelling. Not loud, but persuasive and energetic, and not get bogged down in the negatives when there are many positives to share. Notably, on General Kellogg, his daughter is often in Kiev. She helps. I think she runs the Weatherman Foundation, which does so much great work for veterans. So his family understands the reality here, and I think that's a good sign. But even then, we can't take that for granted. We have to, and I see this, for example, with like Elon Musk. tweeting all the time now, "Make Europe great again." Well, we need to get Ukraine into that conversation. That's the key mission, and that's something I'm really focused on these next days. And I think, for example, here's a way. Like you mentioned Crimea. Okay, well, we have the Trump administration talking about how strategically important Greenland will be. I think Crimea, arguably more strategically important. We talk about the Chagos Islands or Chagos Island, how important that is that your country is about to give up to China. I don't think America's going to try let that happen. Crimea is at the very least equally as strategically important. But we need to make that case. We're going to say if you're talking about Greenland, why not talk about Crimea? And so we have to be savvy and sort of energetic on this. And I think, and speaking of energy, Jonathan, when you speak of the pace of Washington, like the sclerotic bureaucracy, well, we're frustrated with that here in Ukraine. We've seen what that does. We've seen how that lets the tyrants win. Well, and this is where the empathy comes in. This is precisely what MAGA wants in America. They're sick of that. And that's why we see the total course correction, a total opposite of sclerotic Washington. We see, I know you choose what adjective you want to describe it, but it's definitely not slow.
I mean, we're talking before we hit record because, I'm not a MAGA head, as people who are watching the channel will know, and my natural inclination is a certain degree of horror at the sort of destructive energy that's being unleashed. But what you're saying here is interesting. People got fed up, administration after administration on both the left and right saying they're going to change things. Nothing visibly changes. They have voted in a wrecking ball. And I think your point was that the American people have very consciously voted a wrecking ball. My question is, can that wrecking ball build something when the dust settles at the end of that kind of administrative carnage?
Yeah, but this is the key question. I think, but this also is a responsibility of public voices. And so in the case of, like here in your program to say, okay, let's examine, let's look at USAID. Okay, we understand you don't want to fund all this stuff. And actually, I had a lot of angry elite Ukrainians this week who took money from USAID screaming at me in a very nasty way. But you know who doesn't? The soldiers of the front line, the Ukrainians who work in hospitals who really needed USAID funding. And they lost it. I mean, it's a big problem for them, and that's something we're working to help, and we can go into detail on it. But they were not screaming because they understand that they really need the support, and you have to understand the mood in America. But the people in Kyiv, for example, screaming at me actually confirmed what Americans don't want to pay for. And I think so. We have to be cognizant of this, and like if we're going to sit and complain about Jake Sullivan and Joe Biden, which is they were the latest representatives of a bipartisan movement. I mean, remember it was George H.W. Bush, former CIA director, who urged Ukrainians to stick with Moscow. You don't need freedom. I mean, because rich people don't care the people. You just you don't need your
freedom stuff just causes problems, right? Inconvenience and problems.
Yeah. And George W. talked about freedom, but he wasn't, when it comes down to it, it takes a hard work to preserve it and defend it around the world. And so and this we've had this bipartisan efforts to de-arm Ukraine, to slow down support for Ukraine. And we saw a lethargic policy these past years, and even I would even call it almost like a pacifier, because you give a baby to shut up. Like for almost 2 years, for more than 2 years, we had the chorus. Ukraine needs F-16s, great fighter jets, and Washington kept saying, "Oh, it's coming, and nothing was happening." Right? Finally, last summer in July, the first few arrived from, was it the Netherlands?
Netherlands, yeah. In fact, not a single one's come from the US. They've all come from European air forces, including the training as well.
But they needed the support from. There has been some training in the US, but they needed the permission of the US because it's American technology.
Exactly, they could withhold the permission. Yeah,
and I saw this because it affected me. I was making a big deal all the time, and I have friends who were top F-16 pilots. And so I had the straight scoop from them, and they said, one of them said to me, "It's in American interest to pretend we're going to give a bunch of F-16s, but to actually delay doing anything as long as possible. And that's exactly what happened. And then with like originally it was like 4 that arrived in July, and when those arrived, it's not enough to make a big difference. It was a pacifier, because what it did, if Ukrainians were to ask for more at that time, they would look ungrateful, and it'd be so easy to spin it into that. So everyone just shut up, and everyone stopped saying we need F-16s, because the Biden administration shoved a small pacifier into the pro-Ukrainian mouths and said, "Here's your few F-16s. Shut up and stop complaining." And we saw that pacifying policy, that appeasement policy, during the Biden time, and now I think there is a chance, if we're smart here, to say, okay, we certainly have there's energy in Washington, and there is an executive, like in the business sense of let's clean house, let's and the startup sense. Okay, how does Ukraine fit into that story? One of the best ways Ukraine fits into that story is with its drone innovation. Elon Musk tweeted a couple of days ago what a mess the Pentagon is. Slow, fat, lethargic, all this stuff. And we've seen it here. I've seen so many defense contractors come to Ukraine with their great big egos. And they come here because they think, I can make a lot of money from Ukrainians in the war. Oh, we're going to give you some of our drones and you're going to love them. And they're useless. And one of the main things is that they even like savvy, smart defense industry execs, young guys who are in the American military, they don't realize how often you have to adapt drones, at the front lines, like, to deal with the electronic warfare, for example. And once they realize it, it's almost too much for them. They can't imagine having to go back and reform their business plan, and so they just ignore it and they just leave. And now we have these Anduril and others, building major drone facilities. Like Anduril's going to build one in Ohio, Palmer Luckey's company, I think, and they build themselves as the innovators, but they're not ready for it. And so we have the problem we have now in Washington is like Elon and others will say they're right to say that the Pentagon is not ready for not only for the future but for the present. They're not ready for yesterday, but they're running into the arms of these smooth talking so-called innovators like Anduril, for example, who say, "Oh yeah, we're going to take over. We're the innovators." But those guys are just like the Pentagon in a way. They're missing the real innovation that's happening here out of necessity and a desire truly to be free. And so here's where we have to make sure we're in that conversation. And I would say every time Elon Musk tweets about the waste of the Pentagon or how great Anduril is, or all these other companies, then everyone who supports Ukraine needs to be there. Not on Blue Sky. Get yourself on X, respond and push and tell the stories of the incredible innovation happening here in Ukraine. Because China is paying attention and we're not.
That's it. North Korea was there precisely to try and learn some of these lessons. Unfortunately, it didn't go quite the way they thought. We'll maybe come on to that in a minute. But as we're on the topic of creating opportunities, and we can only hope that Kellogg or someone who advises him listens to this video, we have this extraordinary conversation about rare earth metals and the astronomical value of minerals, metals, hydrocarbons that are locked into the Ukrainian soil, which has barely scratched the surface, actually. The last 30 years, they've been developing their economy in various ways, but focusing on agriculture and various other things, becoming once again, one of the breadbasket of the world, which is extraordinary, but they've hardly touched this extraordinary sort of mineral wealth that sits beneath the soil. Now, of course, some of that is in occupied territory, and the majority is not, but it certainly covers, it's a lot of these are locked up in those eastern regions, which are either under occupation or much closer to the front lines. Trump has really seemed to, this has got his attention. And this is something we've been talking about for months and months. There's no point appealing to Trump on abstract things like democracy and abstraction of political values. But if you can talk in a transactional way about developing wealth and developing this sort of physical opportunity, that's where we need to get his attention. And some genius has been able to do that through the rare earth conversation. However, despite him being excited in that, it seems clear that a couple of things need to happen. Russia needs to lose and be ejected from those territories. 300 billion in Russian central bank funds needs to be made available so Ukraine can purchase weapons. And Ukraine probably needs to, widen the draft to comprehensively be able to eject Russia and then defend those territories. But do you think we should be beating this drum more about the financial opportunities in a free Ukraine, as opposed to the media, which endlessly talks about sort of, Russian hydrocarbons and, the infinite wealth that comes from Russia?
Yes, for sure. But I also, before I go into the details in the minerals, I think we also need to point out that the cultural part does matter. For example, the Trump team, the Trump administration is very close to Polish conservatives. They're extremely close. They applaud them, and Poland's not offering. I mean, we don't see great details of anything Poland's offering, but because of this ideological affinity, Poland is almost escaping some of the scrutiny, I think. I mean, but a little bit with the UK. I mean, Trump, he loves majesty. He likes the monarchy and he respects his mother is Scottish. And so there's a respect for the UK. These things do matter, and they matter for Americans. I'm not mocking this as I say it. I think it's genuine. In this world, lonely universe, you want to have some affinities with some. You can't make enemies of
Yeah.
everyone.
Well, we
And
saw that when he came to Blenheim Palace, I mean, he clearly
Churchill's
him
birthplace.
reveling in location and the Queen, and we rolled out the red carpet. I mean, I was out on the road with a drum and a horn, sort of demonstrating and a sign. He didn't get to hear any of that. He just enjoyed a lovely meal in this, palatial surroundings.
Well, and this why. So this is like why, if it's only about transactions, why is Elon tweeting pretty much every day now, "Make Europe great again"? Why? And I think back to that moment when Macron very shrewdly invited Zelensky, Elon, and Trump to the reopening of Notre Dame, saying, "Because you don't have something like that in Kansas, right? It's someplace in America, but you don't really, we don't have that. And like, there's a human hunger for these connection to our ancient roots, and this culture and history." And that's what they saw in Notre Dame. And I think that was an awakening point for them, saying, "This is worth preserving. We need it." But this idea, so they are willing to say make Europe great again, and they're willing to have the alliance with the Poles. But what they're missing, as I was just talking with the Ukrainian evangelical leader today, is like Ukrainians are not just talking about these values; they're actually literally fighting for them. And in Ukraine, by the way, culture is stronger. One of the best indicators of a strong culture is safe cities, low crime. I'm sorry, but in European cities, it's not as dangerous and violent as the U.S. You don't have the gun problem and all that, but European cities are dangerous, and you get robbed. You don't see that. You're not going to get robbed walking home at night in Kiev or Kharkiv, 30 miles from Russia. The only danger is you're going to get bombed by a Iranian drone, and so no one has really paid attention to that part of the story. Like why is it that Ukraine's cities are safer than Russian cities when Russia's not attacking, but on the ground? Lower crime than Russian cities, and lower crime than European cities, and lower crime than American cities. No one makes that point. We should keenly be studying this, and at the very least, for a transactional standpoint, we should want to preserve this one rare place on Earth where you have pleasant cities with low crime and kids walk to school on their own. So many people that come here say it's like what the 1950s America was. So at the very least, let's preserve it so we can figure out some secrets to improve our own cities. That's one thing. So the culture part really does matter, and it matters to, I believe very much to Trump and to JD Vance. And I know I have a lot of friends now that are working in the White House. It's not just Trump; it's a movement. It's American people, and these things do matter. They just don't know it. They don't know the stories. But then you can quite boost the argument with the incredible resources of Ukraine in both a negative way and a positive way. Do you want these resources falling into China's hands? Like, if we're worried about losing Diego Garcia, the military base in the Indian Ocean, well, we should also be really worried about losing the largest country in Europe with some of the most phenomenal resources on the earth, including key parts of the semiconductor supply chain. And the Russian propaganda has been very good at trying to make this a non-issue by saying, "Oh, we already control lots of this stuff with the reason." No, no. Even in Western Ukraine, there are incredible mineral deposits like titanium, for example, in the Northwest. Uh, Ukraine is deeply rich in these minerals, even with what is, if you exclude what Russia is currently occupying, even what they have to offer right now. So we don't even need to. You could say Ukraine, as it is currently, free Ukraine, unoccupied Ukraine, has a lot to offer. But Russians, where they are encroaching, is some of the most extremely valuable minerals needed specifically in the semiconductor supply chain, and somehow we're skipping this. Like, we'll have American senators and congressmen and women will focus on Taiwan, and okay, they talk about freedom, but they want Taiwan. Semiconductors is a major reason. Well, those Taiwan is where it's put together. The minerals come from a place like Ukraine, and they're just not thinking because we're not telling the story well enough, I suppose.
And of course, with the rise of Ukraine's military industrial complex, I say the rise because actually it was at the cutting edge during the Soviet Union. This is the bit which perhaps I think is not appreciated in Europe or even the US, which is, Ukraine is unlikely to fall at this point, in my judgment, because the state of the Russian economy, the huge corporate debt that's been built up to build their military industrial complex. In a recent report, I think it was by Harvard or Yale economist, suggests that what we think of as the tip of the iceberg, as it were, that's the bit of the military budget that we can see. But actually, what Putin's been able to do is create this huge corporate bubble of finance off the books to fund his war. That is a huge economic collapse that is sitting there, waiting to sort of go off. And if the war was to end, you probably see the Russian economy absolutely implode because of this financial bubble they've stupidly created.
I mean, I think we have to be very careful about not being too complacent about it because we can look at the numbers and be excited. But our new Secretary of State in the U.S., Marco Rubio, made this point well. He said, the Russian economy is at least he got this part of it. They're not like us, the Russians. They're not an upward mobility society that wants to have a nice life. No wonder they're acting like barbarians. Buy your fruits, you shall know them. We see it here in Ukraine. And it's a society, and this is the disease of communism, which I think would resonate in America. The Bolshevik Revolution, Russia already had its problems, and that's why it was ripe for Bolshevism, and communism. But that destroys a people. It destroys human nature in a way, and it makes a monster. And that's why I call Russia the school shooter of nations. Something deeply went wrong in the development here, and so Russian economy. The numbers might look bad by our Western terms, Danish terms, American terms, but they're used to. I mean, how many people live in villages with no running, no toilets in their house? So it doesn't affect them in the same way.
They can simply
And
nationalize or socialize the risk. If in the unlikely event that Ukraine did fall, it now has one of the most advanced and certainly the most agile military industrial complexes in Europe. If Russia was to gain control of that, plus whichever Ukrainians sort of stayed and then, were under that process of brainwashing, this is a terrifying prospect because it's not just, another backward Soviet state sort of falling. This is the sort of engine of innovation that Russia lacks. And there's a certain mindset in Ukraine that Russia lacks. And if it was to co-opt that, then the whole of Europe would be at risk.
it would be, but and I think this is the wrinkle that shows really the strength of Ukraine and why it should be such an inspiring story, especially to MAGA people, is that like the strength of Ukraine is it's not centralized. Ukraine does not have a military industrial complex because it is inherently decentralized, and the drone innovation is happening in little different laboratories organized by people, not by the government. Actually, often in defiance of the government. I mean, that's our team, and so many other groups that I know. We're always sending drones to our friends at the front, and they're 3D printers and that, and they tinker with them and they make them. They adapt very quickly. That can't be created from top down, and that can only be really flourishing in a free society. So if Ukraine were to fall, all that energy would either be used for a resistance, but there's no way that that energy could be controlled by a tyrant. It's just not possible. And this is the point about freedom. And this is what Ukraine can teach the world. And this is where, as we look at, I think this is very important for America now. The cleanup that's happening needs to happen. You got to audit the Pentagon. And even John Stewart said this when he interviewed Undersecretary of Defense under Biden. He was incredulous that she had no interest in trying to figure out where all the money goes. And so like that has to happen. And and they're doing it now. And I think it's great. And that's why, I think the USAID thing, I think there's no other way to do it. You just got to dive into it, and it's gonna be painful, but that's the way to do it. But the key is then what do we build from there, and how do we build it, and how do we build a strong society, and that's where America needs a model to look to. And without Ukraine, where else do you look? Like we say, make America great again. Are we looking to 19 some year in the past? Well, I don't think that's going to work because we're well beyond that time. We need to look at, do we have any vision for what how things could be? And that's why I love the city of Kharkiv in Ukraine. Under almost daily attacks, it's clean. It's beautiful parks. People are innovative. They're opening businesses. Like we can look to Ukraine to learn from this. But I think the great, like the Pentagon couldn't say, okay, we want to improve our efficiency and make better drones. Let's go to Ukraine and study things. What they would do is they would only meet the government people, and they would miss the essence of it, which is the small laboratories of democracy, literally laboratories where they're making drones that are helped based on the intel that people get by calling their cousin or whatever at the front line saying, here's our problem. Okay, here's the solution. That's a real free society. And it's so extraordinarily free. It's hard for people in the West to manage it or to imagine it. And, when I was in Kharkiv recently, it was very scary, Jonathan, because I hate to say it, I missed the old Iranian drones because they're loud. You can hear them coming. They sound like a lawnmower. I heard them in Kyiv all the time now. But in Kharkiv, the Russians are using a new drone. You can't hear it. And every day I was there, it was super foggy. It's very scary. They're coming, and on the channels they're saying, okay, the drone's coming toward the center of the city, to this block or this place or this museum. But you can't hear it, you can't see it. And then all of a sudden, it comes down, and and the Russians are adapting so quickly. It took them a while to get to that point, but they have this huge machine behind it. They have China and North Korea behind them, and Ukrainians, though, their innovation is not happening at the government level; it's happening among the people.
And that's extraordinary, isn't it? And it may be looking at, education as well, and not just formal education, government education, but how people are innovating within that and how people are actually inculcating values in the family. Because this, we probably won't have time to cover this one, but for me, it's extraordinary how a country pulls itself out of the Soviet mindset, how, what techniques it uses to shed that extreme vertical bureaucracy, as it were. And I can see, again, if we turn back to the sort of the wrecking ball of the Trump, Musk, Doge kind of thing, another institution that's within its sights is Radio Liberty, Radio Free Europe. And again, my first reaction as a sort of, liberal centrist was horror. And then I stopped to think, well, hang on a second, have I, in this 3 years of full-scale war, have I watched any of their materials? Has it influenced me? Is it one of my go-to sources when I'm preparing stories? And I had to say, well, hang on a second, it isn't. And I've only watched maybe 2 or 3, whereas I watch 4 or 5 hours of material per day. I've only seen 2 or 3 of their videos in the entire 3 years, which makes me think, well, hang on a second, all this funding going into it, all that experience over decades, what is the actual impact? So when it comes back to this idea that maybe these things need to be, broken down to their foundations, but how are they going to be then built up into something that actually has an impact rather than just, being a meal ticket for the people involved?
100%. And I think that's where our responsibility comes in now. I mean, I fully, with all the complaints we had in the past years, I fully embrace we have a chance to have a clean slate. I'll take it. It's going to be painful in the short run. I mean, my friends, for example, the Kharkiv Media Hub, they've lost all their funding. But now I'm trying to find private sector ways. I'm appealing to some foundations and others who, including, if they're listening, the Sir Harry Evans Summit, the foundation. My old one of my mentors, Sir Harold Evans, former editor of the Times, his widow Tina Brown, former editor of New Yorker and Vanity Fair. They have a foundation, and I would love if they would support like real, honest media that we can vouch for, like frontline media. Make a frontline newsroom in Kharkiv. So we're going to try to, plug in the gaps on this. Another huge problem is with the hospitals. Like hospitals that are dealing with people, like soldiers and civilians near the front. They're in a very bad predicament now, and I don't hear enough stories about that. So these are things we need to fix, either with private funding, American billionaires who care, who want their names on something and want a legacy. Not a bad legacy, or in the rebuilding of, say, the USAID. But this idea, the idea of the wrecking ball. Ukraine's Maidan revolution. There's the political leaders never talk about it, including Ukrainian ones, because they're scared of it. Because that is the fourth branch of government, more than the media. That is the true fourth branch in Ukraine, is the public square, where they know that after 2014, they know that whenever the public you lose the public, they take to the streets, and they're in charge. It's like the original Viking Congress, the thing. That's the Maidan, and Maidan was a wrecking ball, but they did it in a calm way. I mean, there was no looting, there was no, they didn't burn their city down, but the government was deleted. There was no police for like a month after Maidan. Everything went back to zero. And I want Americans to understand and respect that. Right now there's a propaganda that was created by Victoria Nuland, one lady in the CIA. No, Maidan was everything that Doge and others are trying to do right now. That was Maidan. And we need that to be connected. And I think so that again comes to our storytelling. But and lastly, on this idea of Radio Free Europe, let's take one particular example. I think here, I agree with you. I used to know. I visited Radio Free Europe in Prague. They used to be headquartered in the former communist parliament building in Prague. I knew a lot of Velvet revolutionaries, but in the old days, American conservative institutions would send young Americans to Prague to learn about the evils of Soviet totalitarianism. And that's how I got to know Radio Free Europe. And they had such a great history, and it was so important during the Iron Curtain days. But yeah, now what's the point? It just sort of exists to exist. And I think, imagine this, and I say this to your audience, Jonathan. Imagine that. Imagine you and I and a few other Ukraine people, like Battleground Ukraine and others. Imagine we made a pitch to Elon Musk and said, give us Radio Free Europe for 3 months. We've been doing it anyway. I've reported every single day. Jonathan, you're interviewing the most interesting people and in the real think tank solution-oriented manner. Let's give us Radio Free Europe for 3 months and let us see what we can do. Make it Radio Free World. I think we make a good pitch for that. And yeah, it needs to have impact. And all respect to everyone that was working there, but that's why you and I aren't working there, because we think things have to be done differently. So I would love to see Ukrainian Freedom News, Silicon Curtain, take over Radio Free Europe. Let's do it.
I'm up for that.
Headquartered in
Sort of
Kyiv.
freedom coup. I think. Yeah, I'm on board with that. That sounds like a good idea. Well, let's turn to the last sort of themes today, because I know you've got a dash. You've got a lot of stuff on. You've got some big projects you can't talk about at the moment, but which we'll be discussing on future episodes. Now, there is still the risk of some kind of negotiated stalemate. We're reaching the 3rd anniversary of the full-scale war, and now it transpires that Trump has had one or maybe more calls with Vladimir Putin. It'd be interesting, I think, to sort of discuss not just the risks of that, because of course, in a partisan way, one can look at it and go, hang on a second, there's a real risk here of a bad deal being made in haste. There's a real risk of Putin be able to get inside Trump's head? We know that Putin is extremely manipulative, lies all the time. And of course, some of these lies do appear, in social media. Some of the lies have been retweeted by Musk, and we are trying to sort of counter those narratives. But if we look on the positive side, is Trump perhaps got a better measure of Putin this time round? Does he feel perhaps he has more leverage over Putin? And are we wrong to immediately think that this is going to go very, very badly? But actually, this may go in Ukraine's favor. And how can we help that process, in fact?
Well, the last part of it is what I want to focus on because after 3 years of being here every day, the full scale war, there was, a lot of hope and dreams in the beginning after we got through the initial adrenaline and intensity of the first few months. And you realize that hope and dreams it doesn't count. You have your vision and your goals, but you have to work. And as I realized that it was a great reminder, again, that meeting I had with the excellent American retired general here, like even good, well-intentioned people, if they don't have the stories and the information, they can drift into something else. And I think that maybe the best answer, because this is what I'm observing in a lot of the comments online, we really have to understand what Russian propaganda does and what they do so well. And I think that's the most helpful thing to start with, because then we can be defended, we can have our minds and souls defended from this. And here is, I think, the clearest example. And it's inherently controversial because the Russians purposely pick the most controversial things that they know no one's going to analyze because they know people would be terrified of it. So this might sound unorthodox, but this is how I think we begin to strengthen ourselves for the idea of any kind of communication or negotiation. So at the Paris Olympics last year, there was the Algerian boxer, Imana Khalif. Remember, right? And there was a controversy. Is it a man? Is she a man? Is she a woman? Is he a man? And it was a huge controversy. And it turns out that the original boxing commission that declared Imana Khalif to be a man was run by a Russian. And the Russians, they pushed this story. But if you, for people sitting at home watching, they're according to their eyes, they saw that and they said, well, this looks like a man. And the response of pro-Ukraine people in that time was to scream at the people sitting at home in America or Europe watching and say, no, you're wrong. That's Russian propaganda. But you know what that did? That only helped Russian propaganda. And this, it might not be a pleasant topic, but this is exactly how good it is and how we have to be aware of it. So if you're sitting at home in America and you're watching the TV and you naturally think your eyes are telling you this, fair or not, that's just what your eyeballs and your brain and it's telling you that you think that that's a man. And then pro-Ukraine people are screaming at you, no, it's Russian propaganda. You know what that does? It makes you run to Russian propaganda. Because
you know what? Maybe the Russians, your position rather than
you're like, the Russians agree with what my eyes see. Yeah, it does. And the Russians know it gleefully. They play it up so well. And we fall into this trap every time. Now, it doesn't mean we have to even wade into the fight. It actually means it's better not to wade into the fight. But as soon as we start screaming, oh, when you say that it's Russian propaganda, we are actually aiding and abetting Russian propaganda exactly according to the Kremlin's plan. This is called reflexive control theory, developed by the Kremlin in the heyday of communism. And so I tell that story because if we can all recognize that, especially during these very intense weeks ahead of talking and figuring things out, because certainly the skies have got to inquire over Ukraine. This is more intense than the mental warfare. If we can all realize that and stop among pro-Ukraine people, stop screaming Russian propaganda. It's like when I screaming those words, like when I said, appealing to my, Trump, friends and colleagues, but I personally agreeing with there's a lot of waste in USAID. And when I said that, I had some pro-Ukraine people screaming to me that I'm parroting Russian propaganda. So just think about that. You're now saying that my ideas let's say I'm an American who's long hated government waste and USAID in particular. You're saying that my ideas are Russian propaganda. You're insulting my intelligence, and you're making me think, oh, shit, maybe the Russians are right. It's so very much the worst thing you could do. And we need, if we can correct that, we can remove the power of Russian propaganda. And instead we can say, okay, we know you're angry, speaking to the Americans. What are you angry about? What do you not want to fund? And here we have a frontline hospital of these heroes who, if you heard their stories, you would love them. Let's talk about supporting that. And that's how we build. And just as your friends, Jonathan, said from the UK when you guys brought the trucks here, it's all about empathy. If we want to persuade, if we want to build something. And now we're not going to have empathy with the Russians. That's different. They've crossed the line into barbarian behavior. But among the people we can talk with, we know they're not bad people who we disagree with, in the UK or the US or whatever. Let's figure out, let's understand each other's fears and angers. And it's the same way with people in America are frustrated. Okay, let's understand their frustrations. They don't understand Ukrainian frustrations. They don't know what it's like to want to be free, to have, your families fought for freedom for centuries and endured evil totalitarianism for centuries. And now you have to face the worst type of illegal immigrant, which is the Russian and the North Korean, armed with ballistic missiles and Iranian drones. And they just don't see that. So what we have to do is create this empathy. Let's listen to what your American concerns are, and then they'll listen to us. To the Ukrainians. I'm American, but
and it's about tone, it's about telling better stories. And to wrap it up, I think that's where some of and let's face it, Radio Free Europe, etc. It's a propagandistic medium. It's designed to be an informational weapon against the Soviet Union, to counter that, very much like the BBC World Service as well. It was designed to project our values, project soft power, to be an accompanying point to foreign policy, and that includes things like the British Council and others. Let's not pretend that we're investing these things purely because we love Dickens and because we love this kind of stuff. We also think that our values are worthwhile, and it's worth projecting those into other parts of the world, so we propagate those values. Russia is kind of doing the same. Russia is the poster child for authoritarianism. It thinks that its value system should be the one that dominates because it's one where its elite can earn money. It cannot earn its money in a rules-based democratic order, at least not the kind of easy money that they're used to generating. So this is a clash of values, and this is a clash of, worldviews. And I think that's curiously absent, isn't it? Because I think Ukrainians fundamentally get it. But even our propagandistic channels have moved away. They're almost embarrassed at the idea of projecting values and having pride in certain values and a nuanced view of history, rather than kind of rejecting everything about our past and feeling guilt about everything. That's something you won't have Ukrainians. They seem to be examining their past in a far more, I would say, passionate and dispassionate way at the same time, rather than trying to weaponize it or impose, their current, personal complexes onto the past.
Yeah, I think this is why, so many Americans, whether they identify from the left or the right, when they come to Ukraine, they feel they want to be here, even if it's scary sometimes, because there's a true freedom of speech here, because there's a tolerance. Like, you can respect different opinions and views and actually debate things, but still being confident in the things in your society and civilization, because Ukrainian, you can't question Ukrainian confidence in their civilization because they're willing to die for it. After 3 years, yeah, people are tired, but if it was a weak belief, it would have been lost, in those first days. And that's why the CIA and everyone underestimated them, because they don't see these things. But neither do, I think, the American people yet. They still don't understand that this is, if Ukraine was being invaded by refugees from Africa and Syria on little boats to the Black Sea, Elon and all these Americans would be defending Ukraine 100%. The same way they're, saying we stand with Giorgia Meloni in Italy. They would. But Ukraine's not being invaded by people in little boats with no missiles. And Ukraine is being invaded by, something infinitely worse. And because that's so different, it's almost the brains don't process that, and that's what we have to break through. And I think this idea, even this "make Europe great again," it misses. It's saying, well, Europe is losing its soul. European countries aren't confident in who they are. We see this in Sweden, maybe in other places, and the big questions are, who are we as a nation? And Ukraine is not asking that because they know it so much they're willing to fight for it. And so, yeah, I think all I can say is that I think here are the answers. I know it, you know it too, Jonathan. I mean, that's one reason why I'm here, is to make sure that such a place, in all of the universe, we have such a place where there's such a wonderful culture, a way of living, that is freedom, that's free, it's tolerant, and the world needs this. And the evil forces are trying to erase it from the east. Beijing, Tehran, Moscow are trying to erase this. But the complacent bureaucrats that America's done with, clearly, they could never embrace it because this is also a threat to them. Like I always say, Kremlin's the ultimate deep state, the ultimate bureaucratic state, as is Beijing, but especially the Kremlin. And the Western leaders in Scholz in Germany, they don't really believe in freedom. No. And so that's why they could never fully embrace Ukraine. And same, I think, with Biden and going back to, all the American presidents for a while. And the question is now, for the new American administration, okay, we know they don't believe in bureaucracy. Totally accept it. Let's get rid of it. Let's fix it. What do they believe in? Do we believe in freedom? True freedom? Do we know what it is? If you do, the definition, I think freedom gets to be defined by those who are actually willing to bleed for it.
I think the phrase we're going to use on this episode is "make Europe Ukraine again," because if we go back to the past, Ukraine had a central role in European politics and history. Russia has been able to almost extinguish that, throw a blanket over it, convince us that wasn't so. The Poles had a central role in European history. Again, with the connivance of Russia, that has been kind of covered up. If it wasn't for Polish cavalry in the sort of late Middle Ages, then Europe would have been, mostly ruled by the Ottoman Turks. And Ukraine similarly, go back into history, had an absolutely central role. So I think that's the theme for here. Ukraine has some of the answers we need, but it also has a process of being able to innovate and fuse the present with the past, but in a way that lacks a lot of the complexes, a lot of the doubts, a lot of the cynicism that has crept into Western Europe. And it's something both America and Europe can benefit from. That's probably where we'll need to wrap it up, Joe. Huge pleasure as always.
Jonathan, thank you. And I welcome everyone. You can follow our work, UkrainianFreedomNews.com, at JP Lindsley, X, YouTube, Instagram. And always a wonderful conversation with you, Jonathan. And malo pomalu, as they say in Ukraine, step by step to victory.
Step by step. Slava Ukraini.
Slava.
Great to speak again. Speak soon.
Great, man. Thank you, man.